Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, this is Ray Gerard. Welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. This is the program that asks, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if, looking at what is happening in our country today, he could write a letter to America? What would he want to tell us? Well, here on this program, we give you precisely such a letter. We then utilize that letter for an in-depth discussion of an issue or a situation that is current in our lives and our society today. We look at it through the eyes of St. Paul. And as we do these things, we always bear a motto in mind: love and kindness through the light of truth. And hopefully that is what we do here. Today's program, Abraham, an American Cowboy. Now, you may, of course, wonder, how in the world are we going to make the comparison or make the argument that Abraham is like an American cowboy? Well, stay tuned and you'll find out. But first, a letter from St. Paul. Creation was made subject to futility, not of its own accord, but because of the one who subjected it, in hope that creation itself would be set free from slavery to corruption and share in the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that all creation is groaning in labor pains even until now. And not only that, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we also groan within ourselves as we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now, hope that sees for itself is not hope. For who hopes for what one sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait with endurance. In the same way, the Spirit too comes to the aid of our weakness. For we do not know how to pray as we ought, but the Spirit itself intercedes with inexpressible groanings. Now that is perhaps one of the reasons why St. Paul has this reputation of being somebody who is difficult at times to understand. He's talking about creation as if it were a living thing. Is this simply a metaphor? Did he perhaps have some revelation? He obviously started his conversion with a very dramatic revelation on the road to Damascus. He spent time after that preparing himself for this ministry to come. Must have had much time in prayer. Did God continue to speak to him? Did he? I mean, he always writes with such deep and penetrating insight. Did some of that insight into the way things are come from revelation? Did he have some sense? I mean, he wrote in another place about Christ being the one through whom all things were created and in whom all things hold together, as if Christ's presence throughout the created universe was not just something symbolic, but was something very literal, very real. Could he be perhaps drawing on that same sense of things as he's writing about it here? Nevertheless, besides this very figurative discussion of creation, he also talks about hope and hoping for what we do not see. Hope being so important, it's necessary for us to endure the things that come to us in life. And then lastly, he talks about the Spirit, because we do not know how to pray, and the Spirit aids us in our weakness. Throughout this reading, we have Paul talking about creation, talking about human weakness, the need for hope, and hope for something that's not seen, something that will come after. That is our lead-in to our discussion of Abraham, an American Cowboy, and you are probably now just as confused about how we're going to put these two things together as where we started, because this reading probably seems like it has no relationship to any of this at all, and we'll see whether or not we can accomplish something of this task that we've set before ourselves. First, Abraham. One story in particular about Abraham. He was 99 years old, and he had made the covenant with God in the Old Testament covenant, and God had promised him that his descendants were going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and God promised him that he was going to have a large family, and he laughed to himself. He was 99 years old. His wife, Sarah, was 90 years old. How could any of this be possible? But shortly after that, he received a visit from 3 travelers. And what's interesting to note about the story is that when these travelers approached, he did not know that they were messengers from God in any way. When these travelers approached, he quickly went up to them, and he asked them if they would allow him to do a favor for them. He referred to himself as their servant. He offered them rest. He offered them food. He told Sarah to get some flour and bake some bread, bake some rolls. He had a steer slaughtered. He put milk out before them. He spared no difficulty, no inconvenience in trying to present the best possible hospitality to these travelers, whom he did not know. They were strangers to him. And then later, they announced to him that they're going to come back. I think of this, if I remember the story correctly, they're going to come back a year from now. And when they do, he will have had a child by then. But what's interesting is the way he treats the strangers with the utmost hospitality. And the link, and it may be because of the story of Abraham in part, that the Jews developed a custom. Perhaps other people in the area had similar customs, but it was very, very strong in the Jewish tradition to treat travelers with kindness, to feed them, to to invite them in and to feed them. It was actually more than just a kindness. I believe it was actually a duty, perhaps part of their Mosaic law. It was something that they had to do. This comes out in a book written by a deacon. His name is Bob Evans. He wrote a book called Walking the Parables of Jesus. As a matter of fact, we're going to be having him as a guest on this program in the not too distant future. But he wrote this book, and it's just a wealth of information about Jewish tradition and among other things to help you understand the parables that Jesus told. But one of the things he talks about is the fact that in fact this was a very strong custom among the Jews, that they had to treat visitors, travelers, with the utmost hospitality. Now, why would that be? Back in those days, I mean, when Moses lived, historians believe it was right around 1850 B.C., homes and sources of food and water were few and far between if you're traveling. And when you came upon somebody that perhaps had a home, you might not stumble upon somebody else like that for a very long time. So people were dependent on one another literally for their survival. There was almost an automatic or default mechanism of mutual dependency. People had to share because if you might be a traveler one day if you might be a host one day, you might be a traveler the next and dependent on somebody else. And so this very strong custom, this duty developed of treating travelers with the utmost respect and kindness. Well, that's a little bit like the American West. So here we go. We're gonna try and tie this in, but it's a bit like the American West, is it not? You would have homes spread very far apart. If somebody came riding up, they were probably maybe traveling out on the prairie for hours, perhaps a day, perhaps 2 days. And, you're the first, sign of some civilized life that they came across. It was actually part of the code of the West to do this. There was a custom, as I say, with the Jewish people to treat travelers with hospitality. Well, it was also an unwritten rule that became part of the code of the West. There's a woman, her name is Kathy Weiser Alexander. She's the sponsor of a website called Legends of America. She's a specialist in Old West history, an author, has been a guest expert on a number of television documentaries. And so she is a competent authority on what was the code of the West. And one of the things that was part of that code was be hospitable to strangers. Who wanders in, including an enemy, is welcome at the dinner table. Interesting, is it not? There are, of course, some other interesting tidbits from the Code of the West. Hospitality, just friendliness, never pass anyone on the trail without saying howdy. Honesty was considered absolute. Your word is your bond. Handshake is more than a contract. Let's see. Consideration for others is central to the code, such as don't stir up dust around the chuck wagon. I guess that was practical advice. Just some other interesting parts of the code. Never shoot an unarmed or unwarned enemy. This was, in fact, part of the code. This was known specifically as the rattlesnake code. If you didn't follow that particular piece of advice, you were a rattlesnake. Let's see. Cowboy is pleasant even when out of sorts. Complaining is what quitters do, and cowboys hate quitters. Oh yeah, and then who could forget this one? Always drink your whiskey with your gun hand to show your friendly intentions. So, although obviously useful things to know, the interesting part about this Code of the West and a lot of the things that were in it is it's amazing. So you've got courtesy and kindness to strangers. You've got honesty. You've got humility. For example, there are some sayings from the Old West that show up some more of these things. Just a life lesson. Every toy. I don't know if some of this may not be directly on point, but it is interesting still, nonetheless. Every trail has some puddles. Anybody who goes through life would agree with that. Only a buzzard feeds on his friends. Let's see. When you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. A lesson in perseverance. Like a good cowboy, a good hat just gets better as it gets older. Respect for things, things that have been through some trials. When you wallow with pigs, expect to get dirty. Well, we've got a lot of references in the Bible to associating with people of good moral character, and those that don't accept good moral teaching are people that you need to shake off. So similarity there. I say, when in doubt, let your horse figure it out. I suppose a bit of humility there. Wide open spaces don't breed no chatterboxes. Let's say, live a good, honorable life. Then when you get older and think back, you'll enjoy it a second time. So those are, some pieces of homespun wisdom that still hold true to this day. And the thing that I can't help thinking of is the fact that a lot of the people that were responsible for these maxims and these bits of the code were not necessarily very religious people, but they came up with things that were tied to what we would consider good moral values. Why would that be? For example, a fellow like, as an example of homespun wisdom, there's a man, if you hadn't heard of him, his name is Will Rogers. He was an American Indian, born 1879 in the Cherokee Nation territory in Oklahoma. And he became very famous in the 1930s. He started with a rope act in the Ziegfeld Follies, I guess in the 20s, and became a movie star, newspaper syndicated newspaper columnist. It was known, very popular all across the United States back in the 1930s, and was noted for a lot of his down-home wisdom. For example, this is attributed to him: good judgment comes from experience, and a lot of that comes from bad judgment. Let's say another one. Too many people spend money they haven't earned to buy things they don't want to impress people they don't like. Another one, the time to save is now. When a dog gets a bone, he doesn't go out and make a down payment on a bigger bone. He buries the one he's got. Let's see. Worrying is like paying on a debt that may never come due. And then here's one. The farmer has to be an optimist, or he wouldn't still be a farmer. We started with a quote from St. Paul, dealing a lot with hope. So in some of these, and here Will Rogers is talking about a farmer being an optimist. Why? And what runs through some of these things? Well, there's a sense of fear. There's a sense of weakness, a sense of fragility. You're traveling, if you're traveling in the Middle East around 1850 BC, or you're an American out on the prairie in the 1850s. So 1850 BC, 1850 AD. What would be similar? There's a vulnerability that you live with. You may not find water again soon. You may not find food for a very long time. There's a fragility to life. At the same time, there's a lot of quiet. There's a lot of peacefulness. You're out in the open, in nature, in vast spaces. Vast spaces which tend to prompt thoughts of God, of a world besides this one, a power higher than us, a power that has created everything or holds everything together or watches over everything. There is something about living in those kinds of conditions that can, in a way, bring one closer to God, even if we're not overtly thinking about God. Like I said, the Cowboys in the Wild West, they weren't necessarily religious, but there's just something that breeds this same type of perspective on life. You're responsible for yourself. You have to. You're responsible for your own actions. You're responsible for who you are. You need to be honest. If you're not honest, and people can't trust you, and people shun you, and you are living in a wilderness where, you might not come upon another, more people for, if you, 100 miles would take, 2 or 3 days to travel? And if you get shunned by enough people, if the word gets out, don't let this guy into your home, what have you, that could be very dangerous. People's survival depended on other people, other people in the area. And if you were shunned, that could be a very big problem. There was a mutual dependency, as I say. There's a closeness to nature, closeness to other people by necessity that was created in those conditions. And it's funny, but they create, in terms of the lasting ideas that people lived by in those situations, they created things that we would consider moral and consistent and in line with the teachings of Christ and Paul, consistent with the will of God. So that's our connection. Hope that it makes some sense. But with that connection in mind, we want to explore this a little bit. First, just how true is it? Well, besides just talking about the Middle East, a couple thousand years before Christ, and the American Wild West, a couple thousand years after, how about we leave the planet? Would people who travel into space maybe have some of this same experience? Well, there's an astronaut. His name is Charlie Duke. He was the lunar module pilot on Apollo 16. And he quoted, he was doing an interview, and he quoted Buzz Aldrin, one of the first two men to walk on the moon. And Aldrin said, "You're in a place that was, according to Aldrin, magnificent desolation." Now that's a curious turn of phrase, magnificent desolation. Why would you call desolation magnificent? Would it perhaps be because you had a sense of a higher power? Could you not, traveling through a wide open prairie or the deserts of the American West, equally use that term, magnificent desolation? Duke said that there are shades of gray, and then there was a sharp contrast between the lunar surface and the blackness of space. Duke said, "I felt right at home." Now, as curious as magnificent desolation is, to say you feel right at home when you're on a lunar surface looking at the sharp contrast between it and the blackness of space, a void, nothingness in a sense, and to feel right at home there is curious indeed. As equally as curious as magnificent desolation. What can explain those types of comments? And let's see. He said, "The first time I saw it, the Earth, we came from the backside of the moon and we watched Earth rise. My first thought was, we're a long way from home." And he was laughing as he said that. But after that, he said, "You recognize the beauty of it, the Earth, the blue, the white, and the brown. Earth was just there, suspended upon nothing in the blackness of space. It was just awesome." To carry this a little bit further, Michael Collins, who was the command module pilot for Apollo 11, said that when he saw the Earth, he thought it, quote, "it projected an aura of great fragility. And the more you dig into it, the more you realize how fragile it is." Close quotes. How fragile. Could that not also describe the experiences of people in the American West or traveling through the wilderness or deserts in the Middle East thousands of years before Christ? How fragile life is. There's life on Earth that's suspended in the blackness of space. How fragile is all the life on the Earth? You're traveling in the desert or the wilderness, and you could travel days before you meet another human being. How fragile life is. There are these recurring themes. There's weakness. There's fragility. There's a mutual dependency if you happen to meet somebody, so that you need to share your food and so forth with other people because you all share the same fragility, the same weakness, the same vulnerability. It's curious, but there is consistency in all of this. And that the consistency is that it breeds thoughts of peace. Peace. Magnificent desolation. Magnificent desolation. Feeling right at home in the void of space. What can explain that other than there is something beyond what is seen? You are seeing the blackness of space for these astronauts, but they felt right at home. Why? Why wouldn't you feel fear and shock and dismay, maybe feelings of depression and despondency? No. They felt in awe. They felt at home. What can explain that other than there's something beyond what they see? The letter that we started with from St. Paul said that hope is about what you do not see. If you see something, if it's right there, you don't have to hope for it. What you're hoping for is what's not right in front of you. Hope. Hope. That's also something that describes the experiences of all three of these different sorts of people. There's something about it. There's something about coming close to nature that can inspire all of this. To go to the Old Testament again, there's a prophet. His name was Elijah. And he had an experience where he went to the mouth of a cave because he was told by God that God was going to be passing by. So he went into a cave, and he said there was a strong and violent wind rending the mountains and crushing rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. And then there was an earthquake. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. But then after the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, there was a light, silent sound. When he heard this, Elijah hid his face in his cloak, and he knew, and he listened because he knew that in the silence, he was going to soon hear the voice of God. God speaks in a whisper to our hearts and to our souls. He doesn't speak in loud, boisterous tones or methods. He speaks quietly to our innermost parts of our being. When you are traveling through a wilderness in the Middle East, when you're traveling through the American desert, when you're in the vast voids of space, perhaps God speaks to you there. Better than, for example, if you're living in a modern American city where you have nothing around you all day but noise and hustle and bustle. Something in the quiet, vast, open areas that we're talking about promotes a feeling of being close to God. Saint Teresa of Avila was very famous for speaking about how to pray. She wrote one of the best works in instructing people how to get closer to God. And she spent a lot of time talking about prayer. And there were different types of prayer. There's the vocal prayer that many people are familiar with, where you can recite some prayer that's already been written out. There's a mental kind of a prayer where it's more meditation than something else. And then there's another type of prayer, a contemplative kind of prayer, in which God is speaking with you very quietly. And it's a difficult state to attain, but it can be reached because God will speak to you, but he'll speak to you in his manner, and you have to quiet yourself to listen. And she spoke of what she called a prayer of quiet. And it was a particular form of deep prayer. She said a person enters into peace. She considered it a supernatural form of prayer where, in fact, God was present and speaking to a person. So, like I said, it's one of the very highest, forms of prayer. Not necessarily, similar to, what happens when you're riding a horse on an open prairie. I mean, yeah, you're at one with nature, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're in some, high state where you're in communion with God. But nevertheless, see how much of her description of this supernatural state of prayer may somewhat describe what we're talking about in terms of being out in the wilderness or the prairie or the desert. She says, all the faculties are stilled in this state. The soul realizes that it is now very close to God, and that if it were just a little bit closer, it would become one with him. The soul knows who he is. It cannot understand how it knows him, but it feels such reverence. It does not dare ask anything. If you're like one of these astronauts, and you're looking at this blue and white and brown orb suspended in black, with billions of people living on it, but very fragile, suspended in the midst of nothingness. If you're riding across the desert under the sun, or at night if you're asleep under the stars looking up at the millions of them that are up there, might you not feel a closeness to God? Might you not feel that even though you cannot understand how he is there, that he is and that you're close to him? And might you not feel such reverence that you're just quiet, pondering? There is a similarity, is there not? On this program, what we often like to do is, and it's what we've been doing so far, is look for a consistency between things. If something is truthful, if something is right, then it will agree and be consistent with other things that we know to be right or that we know to be reliable. And so, we often look for that. If things are consistent, then we can rely on them better than things that certainly are not. And that is why we're looking at these different experiences between people thousands of years apart and in vastly different, places and times, to see whether or not there is an element of consistency between them and to explore what that is. So one of the things is simply being out in creation, being close to it. St. Paul in that letter talked about creation and all of creation. And certainly, if you're in one of these places and times that we've been talking about, then you would have a sense of creation. And perhaps that's why so many people are drawn to a certain church up in New Hampshire. There's a place up there I came across quite by accident when I used to live up in New England, and it's a place called the Cathedral of the Pines. You have that right? Cathedral of the Pines. In the fall of 1937, two people, Sybil and Douglas Sloan, purchased some property in Rindge, New Hampshire, Rindge, New Hampshire. And 120 acres, And they envisioned it as an area where they and their 4 children, Douglas, Sanderson, Margaret, and John, would later build their own houses. But in 1938, a hurricane ripped through the region. There was a 5-acre piece of land that Sandy had selected for his future home, but that was particularly hard hit. And it was months before the Sloans even went to assess the damage. When they did, they were awestruck. The storm had knocked down many of the pine trees, which, strangely enough, revealed a stunning panoramic view of a mountain, the Grand Monadnock Mountain, with other mountain ranges in the distance. Now, after the U.S. Entered World War II, Jack and Sandy, two of the children of these people, joined the armed forces and served in the Army Air Corps. Jack survived. He had many missions on a B-26 bomber, and he survived. And Sandy had almost flown enough missions to entitle him to leave and go home. But then his plane was shot down over Germany in 1944, and he lost his life. In August of 1945, the Sloan family planned a memorial service for Sandy at this clearing that the hurricane had created. And that place then became this place that is now called the Cathedral of the Pines. And there's one striking place that when I was there, I used to like to go to. They have, it looks like just a piece of a stone wall, maybe, 20 feet in length, maybe, 3 feet high. But it's a wall just, made with stones with sort of like a slate, top to it, couple steps that lead up to it. And sitting on this freestanding piece of stone wall, there's a stone cross. And as you're looking at the altar and the cross, in behind, you see the green valley, some mountains. You'll see sky, blue sky and clouds. It's just a stone cross, sitting in a stone setting. There's this stone prop, if you will, this wall that it sits on against this very scenic backdrop. And it helps create, I think, some of that same feeling that we've been talking about. You have a sense of creation, and you have a sense of the closeness of God. And you can just stand there for minutes on end, just looking at it. And why can you do that? Because then in the quiet and the stillness of your heart, things start to speak to you. Perhaps that's why, in a similar vein, a woman by the name of Maren Morris wrote and sang the song called My Church. She says, I've cussed on a Sunday and I've cheated and I've lied, but she finds her holy redemption when I put my car in drive. She says, can I get an hallelujah? Can I get an amen? It feels like the Holy Ghost running through you. She said, when I play the Highway FM, I find my soul revival singing every single verse. Yeah, I guess that's my church. Perhaps you'll recognize that song. It was popular on the radio not too many years back. So she can feel it on the open spaces of the road, just driving her car, playing the music. Apparently she gets a little bit of a spiritual experience there as well as she does in any old church that I guess she was familiar with. And by the lyrics that she wrote about, can I get an hallelujah, can I get an amen, it seems like perhaps, some type of a revivalist church, some type of a Protestant faith. But she can experience something spiritual just being out in nature. And I suppose many of us have at one time or another. Even further, I found a website called the Wild, devoted to what's called the Wild Church Network, and it lists, I don't know, I think there are about 20 or 30 churches on this network, and they're all across the country, from Florida to Texas to California, up to New Hampshire, places in Virginia, up to places in Canada, and these are churches. Christian churches devoted to simply worshiping out in nature, which can be a good thing, but while these types of experiences can help us with an initial sense of the fact that there is of the presence of God, can initially, create some kind of a spiritual response in us. There's always, of course, the danger that you carry that too far. Some of the pastors of these churches who write little, explanations of their church will say things like, our teachers are the black oak and the eastern cottonwood, the cardinals and the finches, the ancient lichen and the black stone. St. Paul talks about there's a hope for redemption. There's a hope for what's unseen. What's unseen is God. What's unseen is shown to us by Christ, to be taught by birds and even a stone. That's getting off base. So there's a danger in this. The call of nature, if you will, can open us up. But then when it opens us up, where do we have to look? Well, we should look to certainly the writings of St. Paul and the life of Christ. Christ, we don't have to wonder. We don't have to guess. We are the beneficiaries of a tremendous gift. Christ came to this earth and told us who he was, and more importantly, who we are. St. Paul helps to tell us who we are. We're adopted heirs of God if we follow Christ. This is what's available to us. So, it's amazing to consider what is in common between these types of people, these experiences of different types of people in different times and places. We have the people of the ancient Middle East, knowing that they depended on one another, knowing that there was something unseen, sensing that, feeling that, because of the closeness with which they lived to nature and creation. And St. Paul talks to us about creation, that it was made subject to futility. Now, this is where people who, taking the initial exposure, the initial opening of their hearts to something bigger than us by times of quiet, out in the vastness of spaces where you're just simply one with nature. People that take that too far miss this lesson. Paul says the creation was made subject to futility, not of its own accord, but because of the one who subjected it, in hope that creation itself will be set free from slavery to corruption and share in the glorious freedom of the children of God. The created world, the world around us, the plants that are grown, the minerals in the earth, the trees that can be felled, the animals that can be slaughtered, all of the things that that we have on this earth that have enabled us to produce so much more from them. All of these gifts that we have on this earth are in slavery to corruption. What's he talking about? Well, these can be misused. These can be, if we're not one with God, if we live in a state of sin, then everything that we use at our disposal is, in a sense, tainted by it. People said Paul was talking simply in a metaphorical context. Well, and, we speculate, well, perhaps, he's talking from a place of some real insights and real revelation, experiencing the presence of Christ in all of creation. Perhaps it was much more real than simply metaphorical. But nevertheless, he's talking about all of that being tainted in a way. And that, nonetheless, it too was created for good, that it waits on humanity to reconcile itself with God, to become one with God again, and then everything will be in right balance. Everything will be in order. So there is something much larger than nature itself. There's something much deeper, something unseen that we can, in fact, hope for. And it is there. And to stop your pondering, stop your introspection, stop your quest for learning and for truth, simply with the birds and the stones and the trees, is missing so much that is out there. There's a lot of people these days talk about nature, about how important nature is. There are a lot of people who will talk about with much passion and intense emotion about protecting dogs who are left in deplorable conditions and saving these dogs, or they're appalled when people will use either chickens, employ them in cockfighting, or use dogs to fight for sport. Things that can appall them, and yet abortion can be countenanced. So people can have such a tremendous feeling for preserving certain species of animals, and it's as if they stop there, or they put maybe a high emphasis on nature and animals, perhaps thinking that there is something higher, but we're not sure about that yet, and so we'll just focus on the animals. But it is important to consider what's beyond. It is important to consider that there is something more, and that we shouldn't stop with just trying to protect the environment and the animals. There is something more important to be concerned about, and that is our soul, and that is giving love back to God, the one who created all of what we're talking about. It is something to be hoped for. It is something that inspires our spirit. It activates our spirit, does it not? It makes us perhaps more open to something else that St. Paul talked about, which is the Spirit coming to speak to us in our weakness. If you are, for example, in the ancient Middle East, traveling through the wilderness, if you're in the American West, traveling through the desert or an open prairie, or if you're in some kind of a space capsule traveling amidst the voids of space, you're in a position of weakness. And we may not know how to pray. St. Paul tells us we do not know how to pray. We may not, in those situations, we may not know how to pray to God, but if we're at least open to the fact that there is something bigger, something out there, and if we can't jump in a space capsule and immerse ourselves in the blackness of space, perhaps you can at least do like the songwriter Maren Morris did, simply take a drive on the open road, or perhaps if if you happen to be somewhere in the area of Ringe, New Hampshire, you can go up to the Cathedral of the Pines and just open yourself up to the fact that there is something higher, something greater. And maybe then, even if you don't know how to pray, if you allow your soul to be open to it, maybe in that place of weakness, that place of letting go a little bit of yourself, that the Spirit, in fact, may enter in, as Paul says, that it may come to aid you and teach you how to pray. It's interesting, Paul talks about the fact that the Spirit intercedes with inexpressible groanings. At those times when you're out in nature and perhaps these vulnerable situations, what would you long for? What would your heart groan for? Would it groan for a cup of coffee and some biscuits, and that would be it? That would be all, nothing more. The next meal, the next place to bed down for a night, would that be it? Or would it perhaps occur to you to long for something more, to hope for something unseen? Paul, speaks to us of, in a way, he's describing this experience of, without actually knowing what we're really looking for, knowing what we're really thinking of, that, we do long for something, that we are somehow in some way close to God in those settings. There was one time when I guess I experienced that more than otherwise. I was in a hospital. Had an overnight. I spent a couple of nights in a hospital. The only time in my life when I've actually, there was a time when I was too young for me to remember. I think it was only 2 or 3. But other than that, the only time in my life when I've actually spent time overnight in the hospital. And the reason was there were clots of blood in my lung, which is a life-threatening situation. Clots in that location can easily travel to somebody's heart, and when they do that, often enough, people will die. So this was a life-threatening situation, and it's kind of funny. I went into the hospital for one thing, and they found this instead. So it was surprising and unexpected. But it was during the few nights that I had in the hospital when one night, I don't know if I was asleep or semi-asleep or what it was, but I had an image of something, I guess, similar, like, what these astronauts might have seen, an image of the Earth, an image of being above the Earth, and an image of a light off in the distance. It was crescent-shaped. It was like it was just beyond the periphery of the Earth. There was a light on the other side. And I had this severe sense that, that's where God was. And it was almost as if, the sensation was, being halfway between this life and the next. But much like, what is talked about by some of these people that have these experiences, there's a peace to it. There's an awesomeness to it. There's a refreshing quality to it. And it's just odd that the same type of thing comes up from all of these different perspectives. Years apart, thousands of miles apart, cultures apart, different people from different types of life experiences, all can feel this oneness. All can feel a closeness to God, and even in those situations, we talked earlier about these bits of wisdom from the people in the American West. Even if they don't speak in terms of God, can we not perhaps see a closeness to God in the fact that the things that they come up with, the rules they devise for themselves to live by, in fact, are godly? Are they godly inspired? It's all about humility and honesty and hospitality. These, could you say they're inspired to some degree? They're living in a situation that they're living in ways that, are consistent with being close to God. It's curious. It's curious, is it not? And if all of this suggests nothing else, maybe it just helps, maybe it just suggests more and more of a reinforcement of the fact that, He is real, He is there. It's about the love, it's about the kindness, and that it can be experienced here in our lives. And even more so if we allow ourselves to get closer to it. And of course, you can do that in nature, but the most, I think, direct way, if you're trying to look for any of that, the most direct way I've ever found is in Eucharistic adoration. You go to Him. You put yourself in His presence. There's nothing higher, nothing better than to spend time there. But perhaps more on that on another program. For today, we'll be just simply satisfied with talking about experiences with nature that we've done. We hope it's been of some interest to you. We hope you join us again. This has been Ray Gerard. Until next time, thanks for listening, and God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.